Dr. Shawna Pandya is a scientist astronaut candidate, director of the Space Medicine Group, and chief instructor of the Operational Space Medicine course with the International Institute for Astronautical Sciences and Project Possum. Combining her passions for medicine, science, and adventure, as well as space, she's also a physician, an aquanaut, a martial artist, an advanced diver, a skydiver, and a pilot in training. She's currently completing a fellowship in wilderness medicine, is a fellow of the Explorers Club, and a podcast host with the World Extreme Medicine's Webcast series. Dr. Pandya has earned 3 degrees in neuroscience, medicine, and space, and is multilingual in French and Spanish. She attended the graduate program at Singularity University and interned at NASA. She's an active physician on the front lines throughout COVID and teaches at the University of Alberta, where she's earned 2 of her degrees. She served as commander in 2020 at the Mars Desert Research Station, and her expeditions were captured in the Land Rover short released with Apollo 11 First Steps film. She was also one of the first to test a commercial spacesuit in zero gravity. Her corporate experience includes her roles as VP Immersive Medicine at Luxonic Technologies and Director of Medical Research at Orbital Assembly Corporation. And she serves as medical advisor to several space medical and technology companies. In 2021, Dr. Pandya was named one of the Women's Executive Network's top 100 most powerful women in Canada and a Canadian Space Agency Space Ambassador. Welcome, Shawna.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful welcome, Teresa. Can you see and hear me and see my slides okay?
So Perfect. Far, so good.
Okay, awesome. Let's get to it. So as you've heard, everyone, my name is Dr. Shawna Pandya. I'm a physician, scientist, astronaut candidate, explorer, aquanaut, and so much more. And so what this means is I get to do cool things like test spacesuits in microgravity on parabolic flight, which you may have heard of as the Vomit Comet. And I could tell you about how much fun that is, but I would rather show you. So this is a video of some of the testing that we've done in zero G. And we'll just play the first minute of this.
So that I can record it.
No rain in the back, though? Not rain in the back. Umbrella?
So, Adam, I will get the billboard back.
Tell you that is every bit as fun as it looks, and it's impossible to be in a spacesuit in zero G and not have a giant smile on your face. Some of the other things that we've done in our work with Possum and IIAS, we've tested spacesuits. This is a different type of spacesuit, EVA spacesuit, so the kind that you will see on Apollo spacewalks, outside the International Space Station on spacewalks. So we've tested this type of spacesuit with the Canadian Space Agency in a different type of gravity simulation. We've tested these suits in water crash landing scenarios. I've earned my aquanaut designation on the 2019 Neptune mission. So as you're quickly learning, the space and exploration world is full of acronyms, and Neptune is no different, stands for Nautical Experiments in Physiology, Technology, and Underwater Exploration. I've earned my dive medical technician designation at the Aquarius Reef Base, where NASA runs its NEMO mission. So another acronym, NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations Habitat. I've been lucky enough to serve as crew medical officer as well as commander at the Mars Desert Research Station. We call it real life on fake Mars. It looks like Tatooine, but you're living in a simulated Mars mission. And all this is to say that in my time in all of these extreme, high-risk operational environments, I've learned a thing or two. And so I'd like to take my time today to share with you 5 key lessons about leadership, success, failure, teamwork, and pushing the limits. And so the first lesson that I want to talk to you about is success. Because we often think that when we see someone that we view as successful, it's like they went from point A to point B. They just woke up like this. And in reality, success looks a lot more like this. In reality, success is often 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And I want to start off by saying that it is okay to fail. So let me say that one more time. It is okay to fail. And as one of my friends, who is Canada's 7th female fighter pilot, once said, if you're always winning, you're in the wrong league. And if you're always winning, you're either lucky, lying, or God themselves. And so here, I want to tell you a story about one of my training days. So my training simulations. So this is from 2018 when we were doing crash landing simulations. So we wanted to test how this IVA, there's another acronym, intravehicular activity spacesuit, integrated with the water. If you had to perform an emergency landing in the water, or if your space capsule landed in the water and you had to swim to your emergency raft. So in this particular scenario, we were simulating being dropped from a parachute into the ocean, and we had to unlatch the harnesses, deploy our portable flotation devices. Those are those yellow buoyant things that you see under my armpits there. We had to pull up the visor of our spacesuit, pull the seals on our spacesuit so no water could get in, swim over to the emergency life raft, climb up the raft, declare ourselves home free, and the success would look something like this. Simple, right? Well, I found out the hard way and pretty quickly how important it was to have pulled those seals on the spacesuit tightly, because as soon as I landed in the water, my spacesuit took on a whole bunch of water, and I was still buoyant because of those yellow flotation devices. But by the time I got to the ladder of the emergency raft, not only was I pulling up my own body weight and the weight of the spacesuit, but the weight of a spacesuit full of water. So it's no easy task. And I struggled in this scenario that should have been 2 minutes. It took me 10 minutes. I was focusing on every millimeter of ground gained. My fingers were begging and screaming to get up. And finally, what my success ended up looking like this. And so the first lesson I want to share with you is that success isn't always pretty and success isn't always perfect. And to orientate you as to what's going on here, up in the right hand corner, that black thing sticking out is my shoe, and that giant blob of an orange human goldfish is me, tangled up in the ladder, face down in a raft full of water as well. And so what got me through that scenario? I want to share with you now the research around resilience. So what is resilience? It's that mental fortitude, that grit, that toughness, what we call stick-to-itiveness. And it's particularly important these days when we're in a global pandemic and we need to learn about how to forge on and how to do it in a way that's productive. And so there's actually research around resilience that shows that it's not something that you and I are born with, but it's a learned trait that can be broken down into 5 key traits, and that we can actually apply this in daily life to make ourselves more resilient. And it comes down to breaking things down, positive self-talk, mental rehearsal, impulse control, and positive social supports. So coming back to this success scenario, every single one of those elements of resilience came into play that day. And so there was that positive self-talk, telling myself that I had this. There was breaking things down. It wasn't for me focusing on getting from the bottom of the ladder to the top with my spacesuit full of water, but focusing on the next millimeter of ground gained. There was that mental rehearsal in my mind. I'm putting myself as if I were in the ocean, and if I chose to give up, well, then that was akin to accepting death. There was the impulse control, resisting with my fingers that were screaming to give up and let go and go back in the pool. And finally, there was the positive social support. My team may not have been with me in the pool that day, but they were standing around the pool, yelling their encouragement, telling me that I had this. So on the flip side of that, I want to come back to what often comes hand in hand with success, because we just said that success isn't always pretty, success isn't always perfect. And on the flip side, failure can be deceptively innocuous looking. So this is a snapshot from a 2017 parabolic flight campaign that we ran out of Florida. And what was special about this campaign is that we were testing a brand new spacesuit. So this one's blue, different from the orange one that you saw previously, brand new airfield, brand new aircraft. So with so many variables, we wanted to guarantee our chances for success in this campaign. And so the veteran flyers with Possum were asked to fly in this campaign, myself included. Except as soon as I got onto that flight, I could feel that something was off that day. And I just thought, walk it off. You have a job to do. You have a spacesuit to test. It's fine. And 5 parabolas into a 30 parabola flight, the test director took one look at my face, saw how gray-green I was, and called a knock it off. He aborted and immediately pulled me out of the suit. 5 seconds later, I threw up. And I will spare you the mental image of what vomit in 0G looks like. But 1, it's gross. And 2, if you vomit while the visor of your spacesuit is tacked down, it presents a real asphyxiation risk. And I felt horrible because now we had lost over 80% of our data. And as my teammates would say, you had one job, you had a spacesuit to test. And that's when a key lesson of failure came to light. And I learned that you can be hard on yourself in a way that's destructive or hard in a way that's productive, because we're all going to fail at some point. And it's how we take those lessons and make ourselves better for future incidences that help. So one of the tools I use to help myself overcome failures is what I call the art of the debrief. So here you see a picture of the war room in a microgravity planning scenario. So before every 0G campaign we fly, we gather around as a big group. We talk about our mission objectives. We go through parabola by parabola, talking about what sequence of actions we're going to perform. Then we go into our groups and perform a dry run on the ground. We perform a dress rehearsal on the aircraft in our spacesuits before we ever fly. We go fly the campaign, and then we regather around the table and go through exactly as we planned, parabola by parabola. And we reinforce, we go over the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the idea is to reinforce patterns of performance that led to success, share lessons learned, and also dissect and deconstruct things that didn't go so well. And so the art of the debrief is something that can be used in successes and in failures to help improve performance. And so coming back to that 0G scenario, that's exactly what I did. I looked at everything that was suboptimal that day, whether it was fatigue, overheating, not being ventilated enough, dehydration, and I optimized every single one of those. And 6 weeks later, I flew a successful flight test campaign out of the National Research Council in Ottawa, Canada. And so the lesson here is that failure can be a beautiful teacher if we let it. And if some of these lessons are starting to sound very similar to one another, it's because failure and success can be 2 sides of the same coin. Resilience, debriefing, reinforcing patterns of successful performance can all be equally important in times of success and failure. And the end goal is to optimize performance for the future. So the second lesson I want to share with you has to do with risk. So it comes as no surprise is that some of these environments are high risk. And so we have to think about how do we optimize ourselves for success? And when we look at risk, I actually like to borrow from the NASA risk matrix. So that's what you see at this table here in front of you. And so when NASA plans human spaceflight, they mitigate risk by looking at the likelihood of something happening versus the severity if it does. And if something is very likely and very severe, we call it mission critical, and it needs to be mitigated before we can move on. And this is actually how I go about dealing with risk in my life and goal setting. And I pair that with another tool that I've learned from my time in piloting, skydiving, and diving. And it's what I call a rate of scan. And you don't have to be any of those things to use this tool, because it's no different as if when you're driving a car. So when you're driving a car, you are maintaining that same rate of scan. You're looking ahead of you at the road to see what's coming up in front of you. You're looking at the rear view mirror to see what's behind you and what's coming up behind you. You're looking at your instrument panel to see how your vehicle is doing. Do you have enough gas? What is your mileage? And so it's the same thing with risk. You're constantly maintaining that rate of scan between your upcoming risks, your immediate term risks, the risks that have passed to make sure they're not coming behind you. And you're scanning between each one of those parameters and then trying to mitigate them as they come up. And so when I talk about managing risk, maintaining a rate of scan, as well as looking at how to mitigate risk, become critical. The third lesson that I want to share with you will come as no surprise to anyone, and it's on the value of leadership and teamwork. And so it should come as no surprise that none of the successes I've achieved have been in isolation. They come with massive teams who support each other. And on the leadership side of things, I like to say that leadership is like a hall of mirrors. So it's not just what we preach, it's what we tolerate. And I come from a university whose motto is uplifting the whole people. And I think that same principle applies to teams as well as performance, because we're only as strong as our weakest team member. So why does it matter that we create these environments where people are motivated to excel, where we uplift even our weakest or our most timid team member? Because in doing so, we're setting ourselves up for success. And so if we want to create an environment where everyone is motivated to perform, where they're propelled to perform at their best, we need to take away any barrier that might prevent them from doing so, whether it's discrimination, whether it's hurdles to participating in the team. The other part about leadership that I want to talk about is my model of leadership, and I call it mortar between the bricks. And the reason I do that is because it's easy to think when looking at a brick wall that the strength comes from the bricks themselves. But if we dissect that a little bit and we take away the mortar, there is no strength to that brick wall. And leadership is no different. It's not leading from the front. It's not being at the head of the boardroom, but it's building those bridges, building those liaisons, and strengthening those ties so that the entire unit as a whole is performing at top notch, as well as strengthened in their bonds. And of course, we can't talk about leadership without talking about teamwork and teammates. And so I like to say, find people who will walk through walls for you. And there's a picture of my mom here during one of my spacesuit testing campaigns, because she is absolutely one of those people. But when we talk about that loyalty that we ask of our teammates, it's a two-way street. And we absolutely have to be willing to walk through walls for them. This is the reason that I've been able to do everything that I have, because I have those people in my life. So the second to last lesson I want to talk to you about is decision-making in tight spots. So in piloting and skydiving, in medicine, we are constantly dealing with dynamic inputs. We're dealing with constantly changing environments. We're dealing with multiple changing variables. In medicine, in the emergency room, we have constant alarms, multiple patients. We have to deal with the resource limitations. And so when we're dealing with these life or death scenarios, and all these inputs become overwhelming, how do we make these decisions? I like to boil it down to a simple phrase: go or no go. No matter how many inputs are going on, no matter how many alarms are ringing, you can always boil it down to these two principles: go or no go. And I'll give you an example. So when I was in training in my residency, I also did a surgical fellowship. And I was on the obstetrics ward one day when I was urgently called to the bedside of a high-risk woman in labor. And to give you an idea of what was going on, this is the heart tracing of a normal baby, so 110 to 160 beats per minute. This is what we like to see: normal, happy, healthy. When I got to the bedside, this is what I saw: 50 beats per minute. So we had to make a go, no-go decision. We obviously couldn't proceed with labor. We needed a crash C-section, except when we called the staff on call, they were 30 minutes outside of the hospital, and we clearly didn't have 30 minutes. I was a senior resident and nearing the end of my training, and I had to make that go, no-go decision. And we simply pulled the trigger, rushed to the OR, and I had that baby out in 4 minutes, and I'm happy to say that baby and mom did well. And in that situation, with so many life or death inputs, with so many variables, it simply came down to go or no go. So in the last minutes here, I want to share with you my final bit of wisdom. And it simply comes down to this: always keep pushing the limits. So why does that matter? Well, I like to liken that to materials stress testing. So when we're pushing the limits in materials stress testing, we're pushing the material to the brink of breaking. And the reason that we do that is twofold. It's so we know where the limit is, so we either know not to go that far in the future, or we can take that material, reinforce it, and go even further and harder than before. And character is no different. We push our own limits to see how we can go further, to solidify our character, to know where our limits are, and to say, is this it? Or do I want to go further, higher, faster, further before? And this all fell into place for me when I was at the Mars Desert Research Station on an exploration activity with my EVA or extravehicular activity partner. And we would always choose the highest, steepest, hardest to climb formations. And the reason we did so, the reason we pushed our limits is so we could see what came next. If we hadn't pushed our limits, if we hadn't choose the highest mountains to climb, we wouldn't be privy to this diaspora of paths that lay to be explored and to find the next adventure. And that's why we push the limits. So today we've talked about a lot. We've talked about dealing with high risk, high reward operational scenarios. We talked about success, failure, using resilience to help ourselves in both cases, building successful teams, managing risk, successful models of leadership and teamwork, and finally, why it matters to push our limits. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I look very much forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Shawna, for taking us through that journey. I really appreciated all the visuals and specific examples that you gave that helped you with those lessons learned throughout. And indeed, we are happy to take and go through some of the questions from the audience. There is a question. Are you able, Shawna, while your screen is still up, from Basak to show the risk assessment chart again?
Yeah, sure.
That's great. Thank you.
Should be coming through now.
There we go. And maybe just talk it through briefly.
Yeah, sure. So this is the NASA risk matrix. And if you're an engineer, you'll also have seen the risk matrix. And basically, when we talk about managing risk, it's about identifying the probability of a risk occurring, as well as the severity if it occurs. So when we talk about human spaceflight, for example, we talk about things that are mission critical. So what happens, in the Apollo 13 scenario, you have a bladder infection, you get urosepsis, you have a kidney stone. So we know that that's moderate to high probability, probably moderate probability, but high severity if it occurs. So it needs to be mitigated either by screening out people with kidney stones and also having the adequate materials, IV fluids, antibiotics to treat that if that occurs. So that's an example from human spaceflight and from history, but it's no different as to whether we're going about our daily lives. So if you own a car, how are you going to mitigate risk of running out of gas on the side of the road? Well, it's high likelihood if your yellow light has been on for the past 15 kilometers and it's high severity if it does occur. So then the mitigation is never let your tank go below 1/2 or 1/4. So that's what we mean when we talk about applying the principles of managing risk and breaking it down according to engineering principles.
Excellent, thank you. And Basak gave some feedback that he sees how it could also be used to make career decisions and other types of decisions as well. So
yeah,
ways
actually,
of looking at it.
And what I do want to add, so I do have longer versions of this talk, and I've co-opted this risk matrix to talk about using it for goal setting. And what I do is I relabel the axes for priorities versus values. So how do you know if you're doing the right thing? Well, how much does it align with your values? And then how much of a priority is it to you right now? And for me, that helps with deciding, do I need to take on something right now? Or, is that something for the future? So it's useful in many dimensions.
Oh, great to see that adaptability. Thank you. We have a question from Scott wondering, what would you say has been your greatest challenge?
I would say it's probably time management. I was joking with Teresa before this that sometimes my schedule is like juggling chainsaws on fire while walking a greased tightrope. It's all a lot of fun. I do everything I do because I absolutely love it, but there's always multiple competing conflicts or events going on, and it's trying to figure out how to focus my attention on what needs attention right now and then defer all the rest.
Thank you for that. And that ties into a question from Stephanie about any other techniques that you use to help you figure out how to manage so many different things going on.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few ways that I do this. And so deadlines definitely rule my life. And then I like to say, so in other talks, I also talk about the value of goal setting. And I like to say that there's season for everything. So even if you're a varsity player in high school and you play volleyball, basketball, golf, soccer, hockey, lacrosse, you're not training for all of those things in the same 24 hours. There's a season for everything. And so in my life, when I have corporate positions, clinical work, research obligations, operational spacesuit testing, I'm not doing all of those same things in the 24 hours. It's a question of managing those priorities, figuring out what needs to be done today, and then deferring the rest.
Thank you for that. And Asnita was wondering about, how do you deal with fear and anticipation of failure mentally when you undertake high-risk operations?
Yeah, you guys are asking all the right questions, and I'm wondering if I should have included some other lessons. So yeah, I often talk about fear and how we overcome it. And so my encounter with fear came when I was getting my skydiving license. And so I learned that I wasn't afraid of heights, but I learned that I was afraid of jumping from heights. And I discovered this when I was hanging out of the airplane 14,000 feet above the ground and about to jump out of the airplane. And that's when I discovered I was terrified out of jumping from heights. And so for me, the way I overcame that fear was repetition, rationalization, and then overcoming the worst case scenarios. And so repetition, you actually have to perform a certain amount of maneuvers and jumps before you can get your accelerated free fall skydiving license. Rationalization. So part of it came to looking around at the plane full of people around me, and spoiler alert, they made it out alive. They were there, they were happy, they were there to repeat jumps. And then overcoming the worst case scenarios. So it's not to say that I completed all my maneuvers, there was no issues, but on my second jump, my radio failed, and I actually had to learn how to land on my own pretty quickly because I no longer had my instructor there. On my fourth jump, I hyperextended my shoulder and spun out of control at 200 kilometers per hour. But it takes just, that repeat exposure and then rationalizing, well, I've prepared for the worst case scenario, and the worst case scenario can happen, but you'll make it alive. And so that's how my approach to fear.
I appreciate that. And it's often when I find someone makes something look easy, it's because of a whole lot of repetition and practice and failure along the way. Yes. David is wondering what you do to relax.
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a great question. So work-life balance is really important. And for me, it's having these internal sensors of things I like to do every day. And if it's too many days in a row while missing doing those things, then it's, an internal alarm goes off saying, okay, you need to dial it back a notch. And so for me, working out is one of those things. It's really important to me. It's my way of de-stressing, doing language lessons, spending time with loved ones. So those were my top three. And it's also a good internal check of, hey, you're doing too much, you're going to burn out if I don't consistently do those.
I hear you. One more question. You had a phrase about you can be hard on yourself, especially when you're trying to push limits in ways that are constructive or destructive. Can you share some language that you could use when you're talking to yourself and getting into maybe destructive, being hard on yourself in ways that you can be more constructive, or with others?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so that insight came to me. So in a previous life, I was training in neurosurgery. So that's brain and spine surgery. And then, that's what I'd wanted to do for my whole life other than be an astronaut. And it just wasn't working out the way I wanted to. So I left that program. And it was really, really hard coming to terms with that schism between I said I was going to do something, but I didn't do it. And I remember just looking at myself in the mirror one day saying, well, I'm a disgrace. And that really hit hard. I felt like I hit rock bottom at that point. And then the corollary to that was I don't want to feel like that anymore. And so that's kind of when I realized, well, I'm being hard on myself, but I'm not being very constructive at all. How do I fail forward? How do I get to the next thing? And so that's kind of the background of where that comes from. And so some of the other tips or skills would be a skill that I call swinging from vine to vine. And so when you're moving from one episode of your life, one project to the next, think of it as swinging through the jungle on vines. You can swing from one thing to the next, And you don't have to know about what's 9 vines ahead of you, but you should be focusing on the next one, because at least you'll have a landing spot. At least you'll know where you're going to end up next. And so that's one of the ways when we talk about failing, aside from applying the principles of resilience, applying the art of the debrief, also finding not your next step, not do 10 years down the road, but just finding that next vine, because at least you'll have a sense of where you're going to end up next, even if you didn't want to end up where you wanted to. And so that's kind of what I mean when I say being hard on yourself in a way that's constructive.
Thank you for so many of these tips and techniques to help us as we continue our own journeys, whether they are personal or professional. Really insightful, Shawna, and inspiring. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time. Thanks everyone for these wonderful questions. And yeah, I hope this is the beginning of many interesting conversations.
Indeed, yes. And thanks so much, as you mentioned, to our audience for the questions that have brought out even more of Shawna's experience and in ways that directly relate to what you're going through. I'm seeing a lot of thank yous, excellent presentation coming through in the chats. Much appreciated. And we will share a recording of this session in our follow-up email to those who have RSVP'd so that you can revisit some of the content, share it with your team. And if you think Shawna's a great speaker for your organization, hopefully this helps in ways that you can see where maybe there could be a custom version of this for your group. We try to be here every 2 weeks with a new speaker, and so we'll be sure to invite you to the next session. And we're here every day in your workday to help you with any programming that you're looking for. Thanks and take care.